Hello, this is David Bernstein. I'm the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. And as usual, I am here with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shafitinsky. Hi, Brandy.
Hey, David.
All right. So we're here to talk about what might appear to be an abstract concept. What is decolonial ideology woke? Now, you may have heard, and if you're listening to this podcast, I think there's a pretty good chance you have, that this term decolonial ideology come out of nowhere since October 7th, because all of a sudden you're hearing this term colonization and decolonization and settler colonialism and the like, and it's being applied to Israel. Israel is viewed in this ideology as a settler colonial state and therefore illegitimate. By the way, likewise, many of the same people would call the United States a settler colonial state and hence illegitimate. And so, what I'm trying to do is understand, and what I hope we can do together is sort of go through this and try to get an understanding of where this comes from and to what degree is it the same and different from sort of your standard fare DEI wokeness. To what degree are we dealing with the same thing? To what degrees are these different phenomena? And maybe in the process of discussing that, I'll get a rise out of Brandy. We shall see. So I want to start by sort of laying out like what I think is the backdrop of all this. And I want to go back to this fateful year of 1968. 1968, and maybe I've done this before, so forgive me if I haven't, if you heard it before. 1968 is the year that a group of students at San Francisco State College, it used to be called that. Now I think it's where you got your doctorate, right? No, okay, that's a different place. You'll tell. Okay, um, it was called San Francisco State College in those days, and it's become San Francisco State University. It was a year where a group of student activists, anarchists, radical leftists, Black Power movement, you get it. These people started to lobby the interim president of that school to institute an ethnic studies program. Okay. Now, this ethnic studies, this idea of ethnic studies was going to be different than every other academic program. It wasn't based on this idea of scientific inquiry and social science and the like. That methodology was viewed as, in today's terms, white supremacist, part of the power structure. They wanted to replace it with a very specific methodology, which you might call critical consciousness. The idea that we're going to teach students to understand and recognize systems of oppression, and that we're going to, which will supersede the academic inquiry that the great American universities were built upon. And they pushed very hard and they protested at the university. And eventually, the president of the university, interim president, folded, and he established the first ethnic studies program. And since that time, I mean, within a few years, there were something like 1,300 of these various studies programs established. Now, within that rubric, you have, I'm sure, some legitimate programs. I know, for example, that the Black Studies program at Harvard, run by Henry Louis Gates III, it is a legitimate academic institution, and he has been critical of how other studies departments and other universities have embraced more of a political activist agenda that don't adhere to these norms. So obviously, there are forms of this that can adhere to the normal academic inquiry, but not all of them, and maybe the vast majority of them didn't. And so today you have these studies programs of various kinds, gender studies, ethnic studies, and the like, that have become sort of ideological indoctrination schemes rather than legitimate inquiry. And they're proliferated, and I would argue that they've managed to dominate the ideological moment over very many years. There's a reason why the Rudi Dutschke, who was an acolyte of Herbert Marcuse, the German American Jewish philosopher who came to America and really was one of the key people behind this, he called it the long march through institutions. And it has been a long march through institutions, a highly successful long march through institutions in which this ideology has taken. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what is this ideology we're talking about. This started out as what you would call postmodernism. Now, what is postmodernism? Postmodernism is this idea that knowledge, the way we think about what we know, it didn't come from scientific inquiry or debate or freedom of expression, the way that we normally think of it. It rather came from powerful actors who embedded in that knowledge in society so that it would help them continue their dominance. And that would then that knowledge is then embedded in discourses, the way we talk about things, so that people would perpetuate what they think of as knowledge in a way that just upheld systems of power that oppressed people. Now that was their core conclusion. Of course, you could go deeper than that, and then they would set about to deconstruct what we consider to be knowledge or problematize uh, what we consider knowledge, or it's sort of the way we do discourse. So for example, if we talk in a way that might perpetuate systems of power, it seeks to tear that down. It points it out, it problematizes it, and then it seeks to tear it down. That's sort of what postmodernism did. Now, the problem with postmodernism is there was always sort of a self-consuming enterprise, because it would ultimately have to tear itself down in the process, right? If you're going to tear everything else down, why isn't it also subject to that same kind of nihilistic impulse? And the truth is that's exactly what happened. But a group of later scholars in the 1970s and 80s decided that it was time to postmodernism, to move it away from from sort of just what's called an epistemology, just a way of apprehending knowledge, to an actual political activist program. So when we think of sort of the turn that took place, it wasn't just that it was toward an activism agenda that what some call critical social justice. It uses postmodernism and this idea that all knowledge is relative, but it actually settles on certain points where knowledge is not relative. Now, what's not relative? The experience of oppressed people in the power system. Only people who are oppressed have the insight and the knowledge to define reality for the rest of us. So we should give them the power because they have the positionality within the system to understand what's happening. So yes, we tear down the system, we tear down what we consider knowledge, but we also then empower a new group of people to define what knowledge is for the rest of society. That's what the sort of more contemporary postmodernists did. And then in the 70s and 80s, it started to turn to what you might call post-colonialism. You've all heard of Edward Said, the professor of literature at Columbia University who wrote the book Orientalism. And Said's view was that our understanding of the Orient, and by that he means the Near East, the Middle East, and so forth, was based on a fanciful expression of power, where we defined it in a way that was not accurate, that was not true to how people actually lived in the Orient and their daily experiences are there. And we tried to define it in a way that allowed us to colonize it, to be imperialist. And that what we needed to do is shift that understanding and allow voices within the Near East to define themselves. And what that tried to do is it tried to knock down scholars like the great Bernard Lewis, who really talked about the cultures of the Middle East and of the Islamic world and what had gone wrong. He actually wrote a book called What Went Wrong. This was a direct affront to Bernard Lewis in that form of scholarship. It said, you have no standing, Bernard Lewis and others, to actually make those claims because you don't have lived experience. You're not from there. You're engaging in a kind of academic inquiry that's meant to keep those people down, that's meant to actually whet the appetite for Western imperialism. So that's why we ended up with this sort of post-colonial ideology. Now, there's a third element here, and that is the place of Zionism in the post-colonial idea. Brandy and I and others know the work of Isabella Tabarowski. She's a scholar at the Wilson Center. She's written some wonderful pieces. I've talked about her before. I want to talk about her again. You can find her latest piece in Tablet Magazine that really goes into this, where she talks about how the Soviet Union decided that Zionism was a real threat and decided it needed to invalidate Zionism as an idea and created a movement called Zionology. And Zionology was actually fabulously successful in the sense that it did indeed form the basis of anti-Zionism, what we know today, however many years, 50 some years later, as anti-Zionism. And so that then became embedded in post-colonial ideology over time. And I think that's why not only is decolonialism and decolonial ideology problematic in general, as it divides the world up into oppressed and oppressors, the global North versus the global South, it also specifically focuses on Zionism as the paradigmatic case of colonial ideology and as a settler colonial state. So I think that's why we are where we are today. And one last perception I'm going to turn to Brandy is that we talk a lot about wokeism or critical social justice ideology, radical social justice ideology, whatever we want to call it, and how it divides up the world in oppressed and oppressors. And clearly that was influenced by these larger intellectual trends of postmodernism that I just talked about. Clearly, right? But the question is it really the same thing today? Like, in other words, does the average DEI program at your corporation, Goldman Sachs, take your pick, which might use some of that language about power and who has it and who doesn't, and it might attach power and privilege to one's identity in ways that we think are highly problematic. Is that the same as this more radical form of decolonial ideology, which we all recognize is almost inherently anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and very often anti-Semitic? By the way, Dan, you put up the wrong Tablet Magazine article. It's not Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation. You're going to have to find the more recent one, whose name I'm forgetting. But yes, but she's also written a very good piece on his dissertation. So, Brandy, do you think what worse is DEI really as egregious as this is as decolonial ideology? Should we think of them in the same way?
I think it's similar ways. I think DEI ideology is decolonial ideology in action, so activated. So when someone's in some sort of DEI training, then they have to actually break up according to identity groups, and one group gets shamed and another group gets elevated. That's decolonial ideology in action. And that's where I see it as being similar. I don't know if phrasing it maybe is kind of the first step onto the path of activism, activism.
It's a gateway drug.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah. So I was watching this video the other day that someone on our team shared about that was actually done by a decolonial anti-Israel activist. And he was showing various examples of how this is playing out and why today, which is one of those what do they call it? Not a day of rage, but what is it? What's going on
Resistance, today? Shut it down for Palestine.
Shut it down. Yeah. Right. So that's happening as we speak. I'm sure we'll get all the video footage later this evening. They were showing a previous one, and there was this young social work student at Columbia who was very disappointed because Columbia forced their die-in, which is one of their forms of protest, in the middle of the Columbia Social Work School lobby out of the building and said, you can't do that here. And she was enraged because she says it was hypocritical. Why was it hypocritical? Because the social work school had adopted what's called a PROP framework, which I can't remember the exact acronym, but it goes something like privilege, whatever, oppression, and so forth. And she said, we've been learning, our social work school has said that it's important that we decolonize social work. Now, what does that mean? And this is where people get really confused. Decolonization or decolonial ideology doesn't mean the UK or France leaving a former colonized state. It doesn't mean that. It means that that those imperial powers like Great Britain, like France, like the United States, like Israel, have colonized minds. that are meant to keep certain people in power and other people oppressed. And what you do is you go sort of discipline by discipline, decolonizing psychology, decolonizing social work, decolonizing medicine, decolonizing law, and you shake off these white supremacist assumptions that are embedded in these disciplines. So what does that look like in social work? Well, in social work, we was designed as a field, and you know this, but I'm just going to give you their definition. You comment on it to help people understand how they can empower themselves within the system. And they say that that's problematic. What we have to do is start to get our clients to overthrow the system that is oppressing them in the first place. That's what decolonizing social work. That's the shift that these social work schools are trying to affect. And if you think about it for a second, why shouldn't that young woman be very upset that they're not willing to also go along with decolonizing Palestine in the die-in in the basement of the lobby of the social work school? Because it's exactly the same of what they're advising in social work itself. What do you make of that? You're a social worker, Brandy. What do you think of that?
I sure am. One, I think that it denigrates the field of social work. Social work is framed on honoring, acknowledging the whole person and meeting people where they're at. And the other part is to think that as a social worker, you would ask or demand of your client, of the person that you're there to help and to support, that they do something for you by becoming some sort of activist for you, to tear down some system for you, is ridiculous. It also is a form of erasure, because it ignores that some of the founders, the founding women of social work, have been from all different racial and ethnic backgrounds. I mean, some of the greats, Ida B. Wells. So was she operating in a framework of whiteness and white supremacy? It's ridiculous.
Right. And so we have to understand that, like, as crazy as these ideas seem, I think they're really, really crazy. They have cachet in certain segments of society. And so when you decolonize, for example, psychology, what you're saying is that the whole cognitive behavioral therapy model, which is designed to help people understand their own agency and take control of their lives, is false, and that we should they should instead understand how they're being oppressed, so that they can then challenge the system.
But I mean, there's a reason for that. And there's also a reason why it leads to anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. And the reason is decolonial ideology, wokeness, whatever you want to call it, depends on keeping a victim class. Without that victim class, the whole ideology and framework falls apart. So the idea has to be that people stay in these rigid structures, these rigid boxes, identity boxes of victim. It doesn't acknowledge that even when we think about imperial times, where you had nations that actually had colonies in other places, it doesn't acknowledge the fact, one, that those are gone now, and it also doesn't acknowledge that people move. People have always moved. There isn't really such thing as the global north versus the global south, because people have always moved. That's what humans do. And how that relates to Zionism is that Zionism is probably one of the most, if not the most successful forms of radical independence. An ancient people exercising self-determination in their historical indigenous homeland. And so the whole idea that these people that have been expelled and brutalized and faced genocide have still been able to find that agency as a people, as a nation, to establish themselves and establish sovereignty, flies in the face of the whole ideology. So those people and the ideas around it, like Zionism, have to be destroyed.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And yeah, that in a way, Jews have never fit very well into this oppressor-oppressed network, and maybe we're living examples of its contradictions. But in addition to that, it seems to me that there are more. That there is a distinction between sort of, and there's certainly gray areas where the two merge, between this decolonialization paradigm and the more like DEI paradigm, and that is that I think that the DEI paradigm is ultimately trying to reconcile itself to capitalism and just reshuffle the deck. These are not people who are trying to overthrow the system in some fundamental way. I have a friend.
They're making a lot of money in the system.
They are. They're making a lot of money in the system. Why would they want to overthrow the system? I have a friend who underwent under some DEI training, and during the process, they brought in someone who wanted to decolonize data. I might have said this before, I'm not sure. And what is decolonizing data? It's to find indigenous ways of knowing. So this idea that we're going to do it all by the numbers. How many clients did we serve this month? How many and what was their satisfaction level? That's all Western imperialism at work. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to ask people there in a much different way that are sort of consistent. I don't know what it is exactly. Indigenous
So, I
ways
mean,
of
how
knowing.
is that not in itself bigoted and kind of like fueling stereotypes? The idea that these people from the global South don't use things like math and science, that their indigenous ways of knowing aren't related to reason, that, you know, these people are just walking around bumping into things, figuring things out from some magic indigenous source. It's bigoted. I mean, the whole ideology really relies on prejudices and stereotypes and blatant bigotry. So the idea that these are then pushed out as some form of, you know, progressiveness or liberalism, when the whole ideology flies completely in the face of that. And I don't know. They fought with any reasonable questioning or looking at it, the ideology falls apart.
Yeah. And so but the thing about it is, of course, that didn't stick in the DEI training. The person made the point of saying it didn't stick in the DEI training because that organization that the person worked for actually had to report to the government about its statistics. How is it doing? How do I know that you're worth funding? And indigenous ways of knowing, we're just not going to cut it. And so that stuff is sort of ignored because ultimately they are functioning within a current system, and in this version of DEI, they might entertain the indigenous ways of knowing methodology and pretend like they think it has some validity, but really this is trying to say, okay, we're going to find a new group of people and put them in power. Now, I think that DEI framework itself is profoundly alienating. I think it's the wrong way of doing it. David Brooks had an excellent piece, by the way, in the New York Times yesterday about DEI and about how it divides people up, it creates alienation, and so forth. And what we really need to replace it with is something what we would have all called at one time pluralism, right? The idea that we live in a profoundly diverse society with different types of people and thoughts and ethnicities and experiences and the like, and help people cooperate. And he cites Eboo Patel, who is a Muslim scholar thinker, and saying that maybe it's time that we create chief cooperation officers in universities, and sort of flip the DEI framework on its head. Now, I think that's a fabulous idea, and there may be more than one way of dealing with this sort of scourge of DEI bureaucracies and universities and the like. And that seems to me one plausible way of doing it, is just really shifting its priorities and its methodology and so forth, and to one we can live with, right? But still, it still seems to me that ultimately this group of people who does DEI is not trying to overthrow the system, whereas the decolonialist people, the ethnic studies professors, the people that we deal with in California, they really want to destroy the entire system. And I think, Brandy, I learned this from you. Tell me if I'm wrong. Those people actually don't really like the DEI people that much.
I don't know if I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure how they view that. I think that the radicalism that we see in education, whether it's through, you know, critical or liberated ethnic studies activists or the like, what they need to keep, they don't want to find a solution. Like, they depend on this kind of perpetual state of divisiveness. And somebody asked in the comments, why is the oppressor-oppressed binary not applied to Jews and Muslims, for instance, in the Ottoman Empire? And I've always found it curious that when people talk about settler colonialism, the only settler colonialism that gets ignored is Arab or Muslim settler colonialism. No one talks about the indigenous peoples that populated North Africa, and why do people in Morocco now speak Arabic, and how did it come to be that people in Egypt now practice Islam? That doesn't get discussed, but one of the reasons it doesn't get discussed is because this binary depends on skin color, or at least perceived skin color. And in America, there's a colorism to this where Jews are seen as white and therefore they have to be the oppressor, and Arabs are seen as brown, therefore they have to be the oppressed. And again, it's a rigid system. So those who are now, who are in this, has been identified as being the oppressed, could have never been and will never be the oppressor. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's never discussed. And we've seen this we've seen this with all of the activists trying to spread liberated ethnic studies. They're doing the same thing. They conveniently ignore facts, historical facts, but or they paint facts as some form of whiteness, and we need indigenous ways of knowing, because that's a way to ignore facts.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there's another dimension to it as well. I think if you ask the average ideologue, critical social justice ideologue about it, they might say, well, maybe Jews were oppressed in the Ottoman Empire, but we're living in the United States today. And in the United States, Jews are white passing or white, and therefore they derive privilege from the white supremacist order. So therefore, we have to see them as part of the white supremacist order and not part of its victim class, even if they themselves are sometimes victims of white supremacy. And when they are victims of white supremacy, which is a right-wing phenomenon, not a left-wing phenomenon, then we'll come to their aid. But otherwise, they have a responsibility, like other white passing people, to sort of dismantle systems of whiteness.
Well, there are multiple I agree with you. We see that I think that's what's happening. There are multiple reasons why it's incorrect. One, you can't say that the group of people that are the number one target of white supremacists benefit from white supremacist culture. That makes no sense. And then another piece of it is that it depends on this very rigid structure that even if, as I've worked majority of my adult life as an advocate for victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault and child abuse. So with that ideology, if we're going to apply it to the people that I worked with, that means anyone who held any type of privilege could have never been victimized. Well, we all know that not to be true. Right? There are people that go all up and down the socioeconomic ladder from all different racial and ethnic backgrounds that can be victimized by some sort of crime. And that, this is why I say that ideology is very illiberal. It's not holding the ideas and values of what we would have thought a few years back of something that's liberal or progressive.
Right. So I guess coming back to my thesis is that, and I want to just pose it to you like head on, are we dealing with one phenomena, which is this ideology that divides up the world neatly into oppressed and oppressors and then applies it to everything? Or are we dealing with, let's say, two versions of it? One, decolonialism, which is very radical, which one tears down the system, and another version of this, which is trying to reshuffle the power deck, but it still is deeply influenced by the same ideological forces, but is ultimately trying to reconcile itself to the capitalist system. What do you think?
I think that they're working in concert, very closely in concert. I think that we can see that where you have some people that want to reshuffle the deck because they want to become the people in power, so then they can exact revenge on the people that oppressed them. And then you have the other side that is more radical and wants to tear things down. But I think that the more radical side is what we've been seeing out in the streets and all over university campuses over the past 5-6 weeks.
Yeah, I think the radical camp, let me call that camp number one. Yeah, they're the people out there with the from the river to the sea crowd, and then the DEI people, I think very often are mealy mouthed about it. Sometimes they'll be like, yes, that what happened against Israel was terrible, but crowd. I think that they're not as ideologically pure about it. They're not the people with the hand glider memes that came out on October 8th, right?
But they don't excuse it. They're very comfortable with someone else going to that extreme because up into a certain point, it's still benefiting their cause and supporting their ideology.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think we've done justice to this topic. I'm not sure we came to a clear, neat conclusion. Maybe in my own mind, I still delineate between these two phenomena to a degree. They come from the same sewer. Maybe that's a strong word, but I like it. They come from the same sewer, but they've taken on different forms, and the most the most lethal version of this also happens to work with Islamist ideology as well, and the Red-Green Alliance, and this idea that we see a merging of radical Islam and radical progressive ideology, and that's especially dangerous as we're seeing on campuses right now. All right, I think that's a wrap. Thank you. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks. Shabbat shalom.